Hello. This is the third video in the series on species counterpoint, and we're finally ready to begin writing our counterpoint exercises in the first species. As you'll recall, this means that we will compose note against note, or in Latin, puncta contra punctum. And by the way, contrapunctum is where we derive the English word counterpoint from. Since we are now dealing with two combined melodies, a Cantus Firmus and a counterpoint, we will start by defining the different possible combinations of melodic movement between two voices. Then we will discuss how we can use harmonic intervals to measure the distance in pitch between two melodies. Once we understand those two things, I will discuss the one central rule of first species counterpoint, which has to do with how the types of motion and harmonic intervals interact. Then we will practice applying that rule by writing a counterpoint against Fuchs's Dorian Cantus Firmus, and I will give you some tips on how to do these exercises on your own. I'll end the video by providing you with some of my favorite Cantus Firmi that I've come across for you to practice with. When there are two melodic voices, there are only three possible types of motion. The first is called oblique motion. This is where one voice moves, either up or down, while another voice remains stationary. We are allowed to use oblique motion in our counterpoints, but we should keep it to a minimum for two reasons. First, remember that one of the goals we learned about is to avoid monotony. And having one voice remain on the same note requires that we have a certain amount of monotonous repetition. Second, the listener is liable to lose interest in the stationary voice and only pay attention to the voice with greater melodic activity. That would upset our goal of achieving equality and independence of voices. The second kind of motion is called direct motion, where both melodies move in the same direction. Sometimes, writers will distinguish between two subtypes of direct motion, parallel motion and similar motion. Parallel motion means that the voices move in the same direction, either up or down, together, and by exactly the same type of interval. In similar motion, both voices move either up or down together, but not necessarily by the same amount. One voice might ascend by leap while the other ascends by step, for instance. Parallel motion is probably the least attractive kind of motion, and you should keep its use to a minimum, since two melodies moving in the same direction by the same amount will sound as if they're tied together and not very independent. Sometimes, though, composers will use parallel motion for exactly this effect of tying things together. In this piece by Debussy, the right hand of the piano is chock full of parallel motion. Is this bad counterpoint? It would be if Debussy was attempting a polyphonic texture, but of course there is no pretense that the notes of the right hand form independent melodies. Instead, Debussy fuses all of the notes of the right hand through parallel motion into one thick, monophonic ribbon of sound. Lastly, there is contrary motion, and like its name implies, it indicates voices that move in the opposite direction of one another. If one voice descends, the other ascends, and vice versa. This is the most useful kind of voice-leading motion to promote a sense of voice-leading independence, and we prefer it whenever possible. The best independence of voices, though, comes from a variety of types of motion and the unpatterned mixture of oblique, direct, and contrary motions. Just as we used intervals in our last video to describe the linear motion of a melody, we can use the same vocabulary for measuring the distance between the voices in our two-part exercises. When we use intervals to measure the distance between simultaneous pitches, we call them harmonic intervals. The same three categories of consonance and dissonance can be used to group the harmonic intervals. Notice that seconds and fourths, which were perfectly acceptable melodically, are considered harmonically dissonant. Think of these different categories as a way to measure the strength of the bond between our two voices. The perfect consonances, the unison, the fifth, and the octave, form a very strong bond between the voices, like glue. In fact, the bond can sometimes be too strong, which will limit our ability to keep the voices flowing and independent. Therefore, we have special rules that govern how we can use the perfect consonances. The main rule is that we should avoid consecutive perfect intervals. Too many perfect intervals in a row means there's too much glue holding our melodies together, and they wouldn't give an appearance of freedom and independence. I like to circle the perfect intervals whenever they occur in my exercises as a visual reminder that they require special treatment. The dissonances, on the other hand, have the opposite problem. They promote too much independence since they seem to cause the two voices to repel one another. Since the dissonant intervals are so disruptive, Fuchs and other contrapuntal theorists have disallowed their use in first species counterpoint. We will be allowed to use dissonances once we get to second species. Here is the chart, but with only the parts that concern first species. The imperfect consonances, thirds and sixths, are just right in terms of the agreement of the voices. They aren't as unstable as the dissonances, but they also aren't as rigid as the perfect consonances. The imperfect consonances form a fluid-like bond between the voices that promotes independence as well as forward motion. For that reason, we will prefer imperfect consonances to the other kinds of harmonic intervals going forward. So far, when I've given a rule, I've phrased it as advice. I've said we prefer stepwise motion, we prefer to avoid consecutive perfect intervals, etc. And most of the rules in counterpoint can be bent or broken in certain situations. But the one I'm about to give you is very old, and it's pretty much ironclad. Perfect consonances may not be approached by direct motion. Here's an example. The sixth B to G in the first measure moves to the perfect octave C and C in the second measure. Both voices ascend, so this is direct motion. Direct motion is the least independent type of motion, and to have it lead into a perfect consonance, which is the least independent kind of interval, would do too much damage to the illusion of the independence of voices. That is why direct motion to a perfect consonance is the most incorrect type of voice leading error in species counterpoint. Go ahead and break any other rule if it means you get to avoid breaking this one. Now it's finally time to compose a counterpoint against Fuchs's Dorian Cantus Firmus. We know from the previous video on melodic fluency that the counterpoint will end on scale degree 1. So, since that decision is out of our hands, we might as well write it in. We end on the D an octave above the Cantus Firmus because we want to occupy realistic ranges for the human voice. We could imagine, for instance, the Cantus Firmus being sung by an alto voice and our counterpoint being sung by a soprano. It is a good habit to write in the interval formed between the voices in between the staves, and to circle the interval if it is a perfect consonance. I've also put in the penultimate note, C sharp, since this is also going to be the same for every first species counterpoint exercise that we compose. The final octave is a perfect consonance, which means that it cannot be approached by direct motion. We cannot reach the last measure by oblique motion either, since a D in measure 10 would form a dissonant seventh against the E in the Cantus Firmus, and dissonant intervals are not allowed. Therefore, we know that the final D of the counterpoint must be approached from below to form contrary motion with the descending line in the cantus. A leap would be unacceptable, since the most conclusive ending to a fluent melody involves conjunct motion, like a plane gliding down a runway. Therefore, C is the only possible note. You might be wondering about the accidental. Adding this sharp is called raising the leading tone. It is customary that scale degree 7 be raised in this way at the conclusion of a Cantus Firmus, but there would be nothing technically incorrect about omitting it as well. Here I've penciled in the possible starting points for the counterpoint in measure 1. We may only begin our counterpoint on a perfect consonance above the Cantus Firmus. In this case, that means forming a perfect fifth with the note A, or a perfect octave with the note D. This choice is actually very important for the overall shape of the melody, and its potential for goal-directed motion. If we pick D as our starting note, then our counterpoint needs to have a good high or low point somewhere in the middle. A counterpoint beginning on A might be easier to compose, since the overall ascent from A to D comes with a kind of pre-made goal-directed shape. Let's choose A as our starting note and pencil in our options for measure 2. To figure out what notes are worth penciling in as options, simply consider all of the consonant intervals above the note in the Cantus Firmus. Above the F in the cantus, we are allowed to form a third with A, a fifth with C, a sixth with D, and an octave with the note F. We can forget about the notes C and F for this measure, since ascending from the A of measure 1 would cause direct motion into a perfect consonance. So we are really left with A and D as our choices. Both of those options are good, but let's go with the note A, and let's write in our options for the next few measures. If you're going to pencil in your options in this manner, I would encourage you to think in larger spans than just one measure at a time, so that we don't write ourselves into a corner. The leap in the cantus from D in measure 4 to the G in measure 5 is an important moment, and I want to plan ahead so that the counterpoint isn't doing anything distracting at that moment. Remember that stepwise motion is preferred, and if you're going to have a large leap, you should plan on moving downwards by step in the next measure. We aren't trying to show off when we write our counterpoints. It won't be the world's greatest melody, but hopefully it will be well formed and complement the given Cantus Firmus. For measure 3, let's simply move down by step to the note G, forming a third with the cantus. Now, if we were to move downward by step to F in measure 4, we would have 3 consecutive parallel thirds, which is a little too much parallel motion. And when the cantus leaps to the note G in measure 5, it will have a note higher than our F of measure 4. This is called a voice crossing, and it should be avoided if possible. So instead, let's move stepwise upwards to the note A for measure 4. This forms a perfect fifth, which, if you are following my advice, you should have circled in order to remind yourself of its special requirements. Now is a good time to double check that it was indeed approached by contrary motion. Now, looking at the stepwise motion possible leading into measure 5, we could step up to the note B or step down to the note G. I don't want to leap at this moment because, as I said, the Cantus Firmus has its largest leap in measure 5, and we shouldn't steal its thunder. Stepping down to G would not be a good idea because we would form a harmonic interval of a perfect unison. We don't want 2 consecutive perfect intervals, between measures 4 and 5, and perfect unisons are so strong that they should be reserved only for the beginning or end of a counterpoint exercise. So instead, let's move up to the note B. Here I've penciled in all of the options for the remaining measures. Once you've gained enough experience, you will understand the options in your head and won't need to write them out in this way. Remember also that we don't need to compose from the beginning to the end. Measure 9, for instance, only has one reasonable option. Choosing the note A would mean that we would create a leap between measures 9 and 10 that's not recovered. And a C in measure 9 would form what is called a cross relation, or two different versions of the same note with the C sharp in measure 10, which is also to be avoided. The best choice for measure 9 is the note D. Let's plan ahead to make sure that our counterpoint isn't doing anything distracting in measure 7 when the Cantus Firmus reaches its high point on the note A. The note C is an option for both measures 6 and 7, and that oblique motion between those measures would allow the leap in the cantus to gain prominence. So let's step up to the note C in measure 6. This forms another perfect fifth, which was again safely approached by contrary motion. And notice that when we write in that C for measure 7, our counterpoint overall has had a lot of oblique motion, repeated notes, and not very many leaps or interesting shapes. So let's move down to a B in measure 8, so that we have at least one upward leap between measures 8 and 9. And there you have it, a completed counterpoint exercise. At this stage, I would double check all of my circled perfect intervals to make sure that none of them occur twice in a row, and that they are approached by either contrary or oblique motion. Now is also a good time to sing over the counterpoint you have written, and see how well it conforms to the rules of melodic fluency that we outlined in the previous video. Writing a counterpoint below a given melody is really not any more difficult than writing one above. There's only one extra rule that needs to be remembered, and it involves the starting note of the counterpoint. If we pencil in the notes that form a perfect consonance with the given D, we see the perfect unison D, the perfect fifth G, and the perfect octave D. Although G forms a perfect interval, it is not an acceptable place to start our counterpoint. Fuchs explains that it would violate our sense of the Dorian mode, but you can also think of it as a violation of the triadic concept, since G is not a member of the D minor triad, while the notes D and A both are. So the only possibilities for your starting notes when composing a counterpoint below a Cantus Firmus is the perfect unison or the perfect octave. By the way, we can begin on the unison in this case because our Cantus Firmus ascends to a high point in measure 7. Because the given melody occupies a melodic space above its starting note, our counterpoint has room to develop in the space below. If the Cantus Firmus had descended, it would be practically very difficult to start on the unison without creating undesirable voice crossings. Here's the counterpoint given by Fuchs for this example in Gradus. Notice that Fuchs begins on the perfect octave, but ends on a perfect unison. There is no reason a counterpoint has to end on exactly the same pitch where it began, as long as it ends on scale degree 1 and begins on an acceptable starting note. The goal-directed ascent of the counterpoint is also a plus.
Thank you.
Here are some extra Cantus Firmi that I've come across that I think are particularly well written. Pick one or two and write them out on staff paper. Compose a first species counterpoint above and below the given melody. It is important also to sing the counterpoint and Cantus Firmus a few times to become familiar with its melodic profile. Some errors in melodic fluency are only apparent after they've been performed out loud. One quick detail. You may raise the leading tone in the penultimate measure of your counterpoint if you chose the cantus by Haydn or Cherubini, but not the Phrygian one by Jeppesen. A D sharp would form a dissonant augmented sixth against the given F natural, and remember that dissonances are not allowed in first species. First species is the basis for all the others, so it is important to master the ideas presented in this video before moving on to the next topics. If you are not completely confident, re-watch this video and compose counterpoints for all of the given melodies if you need to. The next video will deal with second species counterpoint.